Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So Lucy and I last night watched a relatively recent episode of Forged in Fire, which was the making of the Barbarian sword. Now, I've just got a couple of things to say about this, which again could lead to future videos. The sort of things actually which I've intended to do for a while, but which I haven't got round to. It opens up the question of, number one, why are they doing a barbarian sword on a show that's supposed to be doing historical weaponry? And I'll come back to that point in a minute. And secondly, is it possible to invent or create a barbarian sword or any sort of fantasy sword that is actually plausible, that actually makes sense? And again, I'll come back to that point afterwards. So going back to the first point, I have to say it did make me roll my eyes a little bit when Forged in Fire makes a big thing about, you know, recreating weapons from history and all this kind of stuff. Now, I don't have any problem whatsoever with someone designing a fantasy sword or doing a barbarian sword or telling people on a TV show that's for entertainment to make a replica of a sword inspired very clearly by the father's sword from Conan the Barbarian. I love the movie Conan the Barbarian. The later versions less so the case, but Conan the Barbarian is a genuinely good movie, and I actually really like the weapons and armour in it. They are, for the most part, if not entirely, sort of plausible fantasy historical weapons. But the only thing that I could really object to in the Forged in Fire episode was the fact that a couple of times they kind of slipped up and referred to this historical weapon. But of course it's not historical. History, the word history, has a very specific meaning, and that means it has to be based on something that really happened in the past and is documented in sources. Okay, if we speculate, if we make up a weapon from prehistory, that is the period before we have written sources, that we can't really call it historical. We can call that experimental archaeology, we can call it speculative archaeology, reconstruction, something like this. But you know, for example, we look at Viking martial arts, we look at the use of the Viking sword and shield. Is this HEMA? Well, technically, if we're being really anal about the linguistics of the term HEMA, historical European martial arts, no, it's not, because it's not written on it. It's not based on any written sources. No, there are no manuals, there are no treatises. There are some descriptions, obviously, of combat in the Viking era, the Icelandic sagas most famously, but we can't say it's historical European martial arts because we don't have historical sources to base it on. We can say partially that it's experimental archaeology or speculative reconstructive martial arts. We could call it something like that, but it doesn't really fall into the HEMA bracket per se, although I'm quite happy for it to be looked after by the HEMA bracket, shall we say, and for it to be maybe a relative of HEMA. But let's not diverge off too much there. So coming back to the barbarian sword in Forged in Fire, I thought it was kind of funny that they went with a fantasy weapon and then referred to it as a historical weapon several times. It's definitely not a historical weapon, it's a fantasy weapon. Unless we class Conan the Barbarian, the movie, made in the 1980s, therefore now part of history because it's 20 years ago almost. So, what am I talking about? Like 40 years ago almost. So in that sense, we could call it historical because the movie is historical, but not really, not quite. I think that's pushing it. It's a fantasy movie sword, and I have no problem with that. And the last thing I'll say on this part of the topic is that I thought it was also very funny that those swords that they made, which were, I have to say, really quite good in that episode compared to a lot of the recreations we see on Forged in Fire, those swords performed outstandingly well, and so therefore that's a good example, and this connects to the next point, that's a good example of a fantasy weapon that they've basically made up out of nowhere that is not hugely dissimilar to some actual historical weapons. So it's got the blade similar to a Viking era sword, or perhaps even certain types of African or Asian sword, and with some differences sort of in its appearance, but functionally it's quite similar to certain historical swords. And therefore, when it's made well, it performs well as a sword. So this comes on to the second point. is it plausible to design a fantasy weapon? Does it make sense to design a fantasy weapon and actually take it seriously as a weapon that would make sense in a real context? Now, a lot of people might say, well, no, because nothing's new under the sun, and surely all of the weapons that make sense have already been invented, at least if we're talking about swords and hand weapons and stuff like this. All of those sorts of weapons that could be invented have already been invented. You know, there's several weapons in human history which share similar design characteristics. There are lots of straight double-edged swords, there are lots of straight single-edged swords, there are lots of curved single-edged swords with flaring ends, with tapered ends, but you can find similar blade types from similar places across centuries. So for example, if we look at the type of blade, a forward curved chopping blade that flares towards the tip, you can find a similar design in kukris, in kopis, in falcata, even later on certain types of bayonets and things like this, and tools. If we look at double-edged straight blades, obviously you can find them all over the world. You can find them in the Middle East, you can find them in Europe, you can find them in Asia, even with other materials you can find them in South America before metal turned up, in a sense. So there are many repeating designs because there are certain designs and certain characteristics we get from weapons which make sense. So coming back to the fantasy weapon design, if we're just talking about swords for a second, but you could apply this to axes or spears or anything else, maces. If we're talking about designing a fantasy weapon, how on earth do we design a fantasy weapon which is really different to something which has actually already been invented? Because as I said, there's nothing new under the sun. It's all been done before. If we're talking about hand weapons, all the cultures across all the centuries of our known history and archaeology, prehistory, have already done it before, or have they? And actually, I would argue, perhaps maybe unexpectedly to some people, I would argue, no, we haven't actually done literally everything. And an example is you take some of the sort of leaf-bladed swords. Okay, leaf-bladed swords have existed in the past. Okay, so the concept of a leaf-bladed sword we find in the Bronze Age, for example, on the sort of Ewart Park type Bronze Age period swords, which I've got a replica around, but it's packed up in a box like everything else. And so leaf blades as a functional thing work, but within the prehistorical period that they were used, they were short swords and they were used with large shields and they were one-handed. But if we look at recreations of elven weapons, for example, from Lord of the Rings or even from Warhammer or whatever, we often find the leaf blade, for some reason, the leaf blade has been associated in fantasy art with elves. So we often find that idea of the leaf blade coupled with what's essentially a longsword hilt. Now, would that make sense? Is it historical? Is there any parallel for that in history? Well, not really. I can't really think of any leaf-bladed longsword type sword that we can find. So the question is, just using that as one example, and obviously there's lots of other examples we could use, and I'm planning some videos actually talking about some sort of fantasy weaponry that's commonly known from movies and other stuff coming up soon, but would that make sense as a weapon? Would a longsword with a kind of leaf-shaped flared blade make sense? Yeah, and people have made them. People like Angus Trim, sword maker, and various other people out there. Raven Armory have made replicas of those sorts of things as well, and they work well as swords. They chop fantastically, they thrust fantastically. They've got quite a lot of tip inertia, but so have lots of historical weapons. That just gives certain advantages at the cost of certain other things. And obviously the hilt makes sense by itself, the blade makes sense by itself. You pair those two things up. And you know, with the hybrid kukri Bowie knife thing that I showed a few weeks ago, if that hadn't been made and I saw that, you could almost consider that a fantasy weapon. But people did it historically. They took a blade from one type of thing and a hilt from another type of thing and put them together, and yeah, it works. So actually I'm quite, as I say, perhaps this might be unexpected to some people, but I'm actually very, very tolerant of fantasy weaponry and I quite like it. But you can certainly tell when it's done well and when it's done badly. And there certainly are some fantasy weapons which don't make much sense at all, and there are some fantasy weapons which actually look great. So coming back to Forged in Fire, I thought they did a great job. They made a couple of swords which looked historically plausible, and obviously they were inspired by a movie, but the root of that, and I think in a way the root of their success with that episode, was that actually most of the weapons, certainly most of the swords in Conan the Barbarian, made by Jodie Sampson I believe, look great. I mean, some of them may have been overweight, but in terms of their basic design, they look fantastic and they look historically plausible. And therefore, when you make them, they work. So you can often tell just simply from looking at something, so long as you've got some background knowledge of historical or ethnographic weaponry, you can often tell just by looking at a fantasy picture whether certain weapons are plausible or unbelievable or not. And I think it helps sell the whole package, whether it's a book or a movie or a computer game or whatever. I think it helps in the immersion and it helps in the believability of that kind of environment and that world. Anyway, I'll probably look at this topic a little bit more in future videos. Thanks for watching as always. Please give me a like, subscribe and click the bell notifications button if you haven't. It's much appreciated, and that way you get to see more videos like this, hopefully bigger, longer, more interesting ones. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.